Welcome to Seeking Delphi. I'm Mark Sackler. The future lives here. My guest today is Daniel Sax. He's the co-founder and CEO of the Canadian Space Mining Company. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate you having me on here. It's super exciting to be part of the future.
Indeed. So tell us who you are and how you wound up in this venture. Just a couple of minutes of background on who Daniel Sax is.
God, I don't know how I ended up in this venture, but I call it a strange pandemic twist. But my background, I'm a Canadian, born and raised in Toronto. Educated initially in economics. I went to work in commercial real estate. So I started my career as a real estate developer, working for the former founder of former president of Brookfield Properties, doing land and housing developments out west, master plan communities, sustainable development. Then I kind of found my way to the States. I ended up going to grad school at Cornell, did a master's degree in real estate, and then spent a couple of years there in the US working on in the distressed part of the financial cycle after the financial crisis or the last financial crisis. It's becoming hard to remember which financial crisis we're in, but after kind of around 2012, graduated and ended up working in commercial real estate foreclosures and stuff like that on the West Coast in California. Then I moved to New York, worked on repositioning broken shopping centers, and worked in some M&A. I moved back to Toronto about 6 years ago, coming up on that, and was raising capital for real estate companies, doing kind of debt and equity capital raises. Life's all about things you don't really foresee and I guess how you react to them. I started to have all these clients around that time coming in and asking for financing for cannabis facilities. It was around the time that Canada was legalizing cannabis, and I ended up starting the first cannabis real estate investment company in Canada called Sensi Properties. That was around 2017, and so ended up spending a couple of years in the cannabis space through its kind of early formation, investing in a lot of these kind of startups, many of which went public and became quite big for a while. Through that, ended up getting into some of these early stage psychedelics companies. I've been active in the blockchain space for a while, and advise a public company in that space. And so last summer during the pandemic, the beginning of the pandemic, the idea of traveling around the country, going to various cannabis facilities to finance them was pretty unappealing. I would call myself on the COVID averse range of the spectrum, and so started to look at some new businesses. I started chatting with my business partner Dieter McPherson about helium, and he'd identified some opportunities in the public markets for investing in some helium stocks. Helium as fuel for future fusion reactors, etc. A resource that's quite scarce on Earth, and we started to joke about mining it on the moon. And that was really the first foray into lunar mining. It started as a bit of a lark, or you could even call it a bit of a joke. And then we started to talk to professors and people who knew much better than we did about lunar mining and the prospects for it. Certainly around helium, it became quite evident early on that helium didn't make sense in the near term, but there was actually a need for water on the moon and for oxygen, and really what would be the what I consider the base levels of the new lunar economy.
Okay, so from the real estate space to the cannabis space to space. Interesting. It's kind of an unusual arc there. So tell us a little bit about, where the company is now, and, what's your vision for the future of this? After all, this is first and foremost a futurist podcast.
Yeah. The I guess you never know which way life is going to take you. I was never one of these guys who was like, grew up and was like, hey, I'm going to be a doctor, and spent my whole life working towards that. I think I've had multiple plans along the way, and to go back to training in economics, everything's like ceteris paribus. The model works until there's outside information. So you process the outside information, which didn't exist in that model, and all of a sudden you have a new model, and your life goes in a different direction. I call myself an unlikely character in the space industry. I'd worked on collectively, I think about $4.5 billion of real estate deals and finance deals in my career. And I realized at some point during the pandemic also that like none of that had really ever done anything for humanity. It made investors a lot of money, but what does that do in the end of the day? Probably nothing. So I think having spent the previous 15 years of my career working on deals, I think I wanted to spend the next 15 working on something that really moves the needle. And that's kind of where we get to space mining. It became clear very early on in doing some initial research that we are returning to the moon. This is happening in the next couple of years. The stated timelines, I would say, are for a return to the lunar environment in the next 2.5 years, 3 years, right? And so we're really just on the cusp of that. Using a real estate lens, if I were to do a small building redevelopment, that's like a 3-year project. So it's like, okay, I could spend the next 3 years working on a small building redevelopment, or I could work on a lunar mission. And so the goal really is to create a world-leading space resources business, in order to process oxygen and water and hydrogen and other kind of base materials on the moon from the lunar regolith. This is really kind of what's missing. If you look at the value chain of what's happening in space, launch is very crowded. There's a number of players there, highly capitalized, and the writing's on the wall. And in many ways, part of that space will commoditize in the small launch vehicle facet of it. In large launch, it's stuff like Starship. It's obviously kind of more complex, to compete in that area. But we see a significant need for someone to make the oxygen and water and hydrogen, which is really the base infrastructure layer, I would call it, of the space economy. Like all of the stuff like, space hotels, space manufacturing, how does that stuff work without fuel in situ? So you've got kind of this big problem right now with launch. We run out of fuel getting to LEO, right? Starship is forecast to be a 9-to-1 refueling ratio in low Earth orbit. So you're going to have to fly 9 Starships up just to refuel a single one. I think it's forecast that it's at least 12 days in between, and that assumes you don't have launch delays and other stuff that's bound to happen. So let's say it's anywhere from 100 days to could be as much as 200 days to refuel a single Starship in low Earth orbit. That's obviously not scalable, right? And so you've got this really big problem there for humanity. And then the other thing is satellite refueling, right? Satellites weren't really planned to be reusable. They're still not being planned to be reusable, and that's a huge problem. That's leading to space junk. That's leading to a wasting of technology and rare earth, rare materials, rare valuable materials. If you put up a $4 billion spy sat and it's got to be burned up in the atmosphere 4 years later because it's run out of fuel and was never designed to be refueled, that's a big problem. That's a waste of a lot of technology. And so in order to sustainably explore space, to sustainably utilize Earth orbits with satellites, we need to figure out refueling as a civilization.
That's the refueling is interesting, but how does refueling satellites in Earth orbit uh, have anything to do with space mining on the moon?
You got to ask yourself, where is the fuel coming from, right? And so you burn 90 to 98% of the fuel getting to low Earth orbit, right? So if you're going to fuel these things long term, you still have the problem of the Earth's gravity. We can build and scale infrastructure on the moon and scale a new supply chain outside of Earth's gravity. So it's, bringing things up from Earth, you're always going to be limited by Earth's gravity. Making a new supply chain outside of Earth, that's really where the long-term solution is for humanity.
So you actually are saying that you'll be able to, or you envision bringing resources from the moon back to Earth, or at least to Earth orbit.
To Earth orbit, to propellant depots in Earth orbit, in LEO, in potentially in GEO, propellant depots that are Gateway, right, which is going up Lob G, which is the new lunar space station, supposed to go up in 2025. Or first part's supposed to go up in 2024, become operational in 2025. Could be a little behind schedule, like many things in the space industry. That's forecast to be essentially the gas station in space, right? So that's where deep space travel will go to the moon. They'll dock at Gateway, they will refuel at Gateway, and then they will go off into deep space. And so it's really about supplying Gateway and the infrastructure that's going up there. If you think that the gas station is going up in 2025, operational sometime around 2025, 2026, I would say it's still pretty unclear how the fuel is going to be supplied. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done on the lunar mining and lunar regolith mining, processing, et cetera.
It's interesting. I've seen, do you know much about the Chinese and their ambitions in lunar mining? Because I have seemed to remember in the past reading about that, and I'm not sure whether they were interested in situ or actually returning resources to Earth.
Yeah, it's unclear to me. I can't say I know a ton about what the Chinese are planning. Obviously, they drilled mining samples at the beginning of the year. And did a sample return mission from the South Pole that was to prove out mining technology, also to prove out some resources that were there, as well as their capabilities for a human mission. They then announced that they're going to build and staff a lunar base in 2025 with Russia. So to open in 2025 with Russia. So you're talking 3.5 years from now. There will be, Chinese astronauts and potentially Russian astronauts living on the South Pole. And let's face it, the South Pole, is a strategic high ground. There was a kind of corollary increase in Space Force's budget directly after China announced that and did the sample return mission. And so there is this kind of race going on for the high ground, for the South Pole. And everything in between. People like the South Pole, because of obviously access to Earth and ability to be kind of seen by Earth in various kind of lunar cycles, et cetera. But as well, really what is the inferred abundance of water, right? So there are, inferred to be massive amounts of water ice in the permanently shadowed regions and craters of the South and North Pole.
Okay, I'm going to kind of throw you a little curveball here.
Okay.
Okay. About 4 years ago, I think it was 4 years ago this past summer, I was at the Association of Professional Futurists annual meetup in Seattle. There was a space commerce panel. One of the people I spoke to was Chris Lewicki, who's somebody I think you're familiar with. He at the time was the CEO of a company called Planetary Resources that was really looking toward asteroid mining, I think, for in situ use for space colonies. couple of years later, the company was acquired, and the last time I saw, they've gotten completely out of space mining. They're doing something else. So what's going to be different for you guys, and why is your time right now?
Yeah, quite frankly, there was a previous generation of space mining companies. Most of them went bust. They were, for the most part, focused on asteroids. We think asteroids and asteroid mining is just something that is much further out in terms of timeline, much less scalable, harder to build infrastructure on. While the moon has gravity, it has 1/6 Earth's gravity. It has gravity, which allows you to scale and build infrastructure. I think it's just much less complex, much more complex to build infrastructure on an asteroid. If you look at some of the early gleanings of asteroid Bennu, right, and the OSIRIS-REx mission that proved out, in the last year, asteroid sample recovery is possible, which, back when planetary resources existed, asteroid recovery was really a theoretical. It hadn't been proven yet. But if you look at some of that early data, the asteroids are reconfiguring themselves on the fly. So you've got material that comes off the asteroid and actually comes back on as micrometeorites, and they almost reform themselves constantly. I mean, that is a ever-changing environment. It is, I think, in some ways infinitely more complex than mining on the moon. We think that the pathway is to mine on the moon, and in timeline, with all of the settlement that is happening on the moon. People aren't moving to settle asteroids in the next 5-10 years. Humanity is returning to the moon and to stay there in the next 10 years. And what is needed as a crucial a layer is oxygen for life support, for propellant, as well as hydrogen. And so, it's those things that really, in our eyes, create the base layer for a lunar development, lunar habitation, and in the same way for Martian development, Martian habitation. The lessons that we are going to learn in figuring out how to settle the moon are going to be the same lessons that will be applied to the settlement of Mars. And so, the moon is really a great test bed, I think, for Mars. In that way, an asteroid is completely different. So there are others who believe in the value of mining asteroids now. To them, I say good luck. It's something we're not focused on as a company in our initial period. We think that we've got enough complexity to deal with mining on the moon, and it offers plenty of opportunity, as well as what I would say scalability, that kind of infrastructure building.
So they're talking about water, hydrogen, oxygen. Are you looking at mining any of the potentially solid materials on the moon for whatever use, for construction in situ? Jeff Bezos, who's competing with SpaceX and Elon Musk for the Artemis project, is talking about moving a lot of heavy industry off Earth. Have you looked at space mining as potential value for that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say, like, in the initial years, it's probably oxygen and hydrogen, because those are the what I would call kind of base building blocks for the rest of this. But in the end, the problem is still the same. Earth's gravity is really strong, getting stuff up to orbit. So if you're going to manufacture in space, long term, it makes sense to get those raw materials from space rather than to bring them from Earth. It's just inefficient, costly, wasteful to bring them from Earth. So yes, we are definitely looking at stuff like aluminum, like silicon. Will we be building solar panels in 10 years on the moon from lunar material? I would hope so. What that timeline looks like, I couldn't tell you, but that's certainly the sustainable case and the logical case. Certainly the carbon footprint of bringing things up here is extremely high. Up to the lunar environment would be extremely high. Building stuff in space is, from an Earth perspective, certainly more sustainable.
So you're a Canadian company, and obviously the bulk of what you're talking about is NASA. So how does Canada play in with the whole U.S. NASA effort, in what you're doing, and then maybe there are others involved as well?
Yeah, Canada has always been, a leader and a key player in space alongside NASA. We were one of the first kind of spacefaring nations in putting up, I believe the third satellite that was put up was Canadian. The Canada arm, put on the space station. And so we'll be putting a new Canada arm, or Canada will be putting a new Canada arm on Lunar Gateway, the Canada Arm 3, which is a kind of crucial piece to Gateway. Canada will also be involved in the manned missions, the Artemis missions. But the key thing is to remember that Canada is the world leader right now in resources, right? So we are the #1 player in the resource industry. This is where resource industry companies get financed right now. We have, a human capital advantage there. And so, really, we think this is a role that we can play within space resources, is to be one of the leading countries. And that's why I think Canada is the best place to stand up a world leading Canada space resources company. We think we have both the space robotics talent as well as the natural resources talent within Canada, capital markets, everything like that. So,
okay, so one last question.
Sure.
This is something that I always have to deal with as a futurist, and I wonder how you deal with it. I mentioned space mining to anybody that's not, involved in this area, and the reactions are like, "That's a thing? Are you crazy?" Or, "Yeah, what, 100 years from now?" So I'm curious to know how if you've got a specific elevator speech to deal with objections like that.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly heard it, and I think that would have been my reaction, a year ago, had you told me about space mining. I think that was my initial reaction. When you start to learn about it, you realize that there is this return happening to the moon in the next kind of 3.5 years, that we will have humans living on the moon. NASA wants to have humans living on the moon by 2030. If I were to give you those timelines for Earth for mining, they're actually tight timelines for mining on Earth, right? If you have 7 years to develop or 8 years to develop a fully operating mine on Earth, that's a tight timeline. So I think we are now within that tight timeline for space mining. There is the need, the demand for those resources. And so it's really about execution and scaling it at this point. The time is now. If I was 10 years before, it was theoretical. All this stuff has now been proven out in individual missions. And so it's really about scaling it under what are very tight global timelines, anywhere from 3.5 years for Gateway to start going up, or 3.5 years for the Chinese to have their moon base built, up to 2030, which is 8.5 years from now, for the NASA to have a permanently established moon base in the international community.
Very fascinating stuff. And as somebody who grew up with the space program as a kid, watching the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo missions, and the first moon landing, and of course, reading a lot of science fiction, it's really exciting to see this possibly becoming reality. I wish you the best of luck with this going forward, and hope to hear more from you about it in the future. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.